So let's talk about the sixth naturalization requirement, which is English and civics and history. One requirement, two parts, English and civics and history. It is really two separate requirements. You have to know English and have to know U.S. history and government. How do they test your English? They test it in three ways: speaking, reading, writing. They test speaking by asking questions on the form, by asking you the U.S. history and civics question, and by exchanging pleasantries. Okay? By exchanging pleasantry. How you doing today? Sit down, please. Raise your right hand. You can understand those basic instructions. Reading, the applicant must read correctly 1 out of 3 sentences that they give you. The sentences are posted on the USCIS website. And writing, the applicant must write 1 out of 3 sentences correctly to demonstrate an ability to write in English. English is the most common reason for denial. Okay? More people denied for English, lack of English, than anything else. Oops, I'm behind in the slides here. There are some exemptions from English. We have the 55-15 rule. You're 55 years old and 15 years of lawful permanent residence at the time of applying. You do not need to speak, read, or write English. You can do everything in your own language, and there's no literacy exam. You do not need to speak, read, or write in your own language. Well, you need to speak in order to answer the questions or do sign language. The 50-20 rule is very similar. 50 years as a lawful permanent resident, 50 years old at least, and 20 years as a lawful permanent resident, then you do not need to know English at all. You can do the whole test in your own language, and you do not need to know how to read or write. Now, even if I fall into one of these two English exemption requirements, I still have to be able to pass the civics and history exam in my own language. There is a 65-20 rule as well. If I'm at least 65, I've been a lawful permanent resident for at least 20 years, I can then be exempt from English and have an easier English test. I do want to say that the USCIS is trying right now to change the English and civics test to make them significantly harder. The civics test specifically to make it a multiple choice test so that you have to be a better reader and you have to have a better knowledge of English. We and others are pushing back. We just finished a whole webinar on this. We encourage you, it's free. We encourage you to hop on our website and grab that webinar and all the materials with it so that you know what's going on. We're hopefully going to be victorious in making it so that the USCIS does not push through this awful new change. But it depends on being the squeaky wheel. And after looking at this webinar, hearing the webinar, we encourage you to write a letter. And the webinar says where to write it and stuff to show your dissatisfaction with the new potential changes. I'm going to skip this example real quickly and just say, if you fail the English and/or history exams, 2 exams, remember you have to pass both. If you fail either one or the other, you have a free retest between 60 and 90 days from the date of the initial interview. If you fail that, of course, then you would have to either appeal or reapply. I'm going to turn it back over to Allison to take us home for the rest of the webinar.
Thanks so much, Eric. So we want to say just a few words about the disability waiver. This is a waiver you can apply for on Form N-648. If your client has a disability that impacts their ability to either learn or demonstrate the ability to pass the English and/or U.S. history and civics exam. Since they're 2 different requirements, the English exam and the U.S. history and civics exam, as Eric explained, the waiver would need to express their reasons explaining why each of the requirements must be waived, or if there's only one, why that one would be waived. So unlike the age exceptions, this is not automatic. You do have to apply for it and be granted that waiver. It has to be completed by a medical doctor or related professional, And the focus of the information is really not just, oh, this person has a disability, but what that nexus is between the disability and the applicant's ability to learn or demonstrate knowledge of English, U.S. history, or government. I want to note that there's been a lot of evolving guidance on the N648 waiver over the last several years. The N648 form and guidance in the USCIS policy manual were altered pretty dramatically under the previous administration, really limiting access to the waiver. The waiver form was lengthened. There were all kinds of questions about daily life, really going to whether that person, really kind of a fraud first mentality of whether the person was actually disabled. There's enormous amount of advocacy by ILRC and many partners on this webinar as well to push back on the way that the form and the guidance had been altered. And it was a big win. So about a year ago, there was a new form that came out and really great new guidance in the policy manual. So the new form is shorter, which almost never happens. The length was cut in half, and it's clearer. It eliminated a lot of those questions about daily life, a lot of the redundancies that seem just to make it more burdensome for doctors to fill out, and that is now the form in place. There are also some really great, not only did it take away the prior burdensome guidance, it also went forward and I think really opened up the form and the waiver to others, doing things like accepting telehealth visits now. As we know, during the COVID pandemic, a lot of health visits became telehealth visits, and those are now accepted. And the medical professional certification has been simplified. So this is a really big win. There's still some snafus in the implementation of the new form that our office is working hard to track. So you can let us know in the chat box if you're seeing big issues with the N648 in your region. But in general, really, really happy with the direction this is going. I do want to mention too that outside of the waiver, there's also the possibility for accommodations. That's under the Rehabilitation Act that USCIS must provide reasonable accommodations. That could be anything from a larger font to longer time, to physical accommodations for wheelchairs, etc. So definitely if your applicant has needs like this, to put them on the space provided on the N400. Okay, our last couple minutes, we're going to talk about the last requirement, which is that you must show attachment to the U.S. Constitution and take a loyalty oath. And it used to be that we talked about this requirement really mostly in terms of the oath and waivers and modifications, and we will mention that. But there's another piece of this that we've seen come up that we wanted to put on your radar, and that is that failure to register for the selective service, also known as the draft, can affect, people can be denied for not being attached to the Constitution. And how this works out, and there's a lot of guidance on this in the USCIS policy manual, so I do encourage you to check it out, is it's kind of broken down into 3 groups. So if somebody is between the ages of 18 to 26, and they apply for naturalization and have not registered for selective service, which we also just call the draft, USCIS will just tell them to register. The draft is a requirement that any male living in the United States must register between the ages of 18 to 26. Anybody living here, so not just a citizen, not just an LPR, somebody who is undocumented, somebody who has a different form of status, anybody that is here on a non-temporary status is required, any male is required to register for the draft between the ages of 18 to 26. So if somebody's between those ages, USCIS will just tell them to register. If somebody is between the ages of 26 to 31, they're no longer eligible to register, they're too old. However, It's within the last 5 years, so it can affect somebody in two ways. It can affect their good moral character, and Eric just walked through that analysis. It can also affect whether they're seen to be attached to the U.S. Constitution. So if that failure to register was knowing and willful and was within the last 5 years or 3 years, if applying as a spouse of a U.S. citizen, then USCIS can deny on that basis. However, if that statutory period has already passed, if the person's 31 or over, or if applying as a spouse of a U.S. citizen, if they're 29 or over, then even if that failure to register was willful, then USCIS should not be denying based on that. It's outside of the good moral character time period and also outside of the required period for attachment to the Constitution. So just want to flag that for your male clients to look to see if they have registered. And then finally, there is also an oath waiver for folks who have a disability. This is separate from the N648 process to get a disability waiver for the English or civics exam. And remember that an oath can be simplified by an accommodation. So for many folks, even if they have a disability waiver for the English or civics exam, they might not need it for the oath because the oath can be simplified. So watch out for that on the N648. That's a separate analysis. It may be that your client doesn't have a disability that makes them unable to take the oath. It's also a very complicated process. If you are unable to take the oath, you need to get a legal guardian or a surrogate or a designated representative. It's a court process, or to get a U.S. citizen relative as a primary caregiver to take it in your stead. So something to take very seriously if you think that that applies to your client. And then for folks who have certain religious or moral convictions, you can modify the oath, and the two pieces that often get modified, the I will bear arms, or the actual oath part, or so help me God. So there is some evidence on your screen